Hello, and welcome to this edition of Inside the Vault. I'm your host, Mark Yaxley. My guest today has written regularly for over 25 years on the subjects of economics, personal liberties, and limiting government. He has a weekly column in KC Research's International Man and is a feature writer for us here at Strategic Wealth Preservation. It's my pleasure to introduce a dear friend and mentor of mine, Mr. Jeff Thomas. The son of a historian and economist, Jeff learned at an early age to question governments as a general rule. He has lived multinationally since childhood and now resides primarily in the Caribbean. He joins us today from the Cayman Islands. Jeff, welcome to Inside the Vault. We're glad to have you here with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, good to be with you. Fire away.
All right. Jeff, you've written extensively about the concept of internationalization and geodiversification. You yourself grew up multinationally, and for many years, you've been based in the Cayman Islands. For the benefit of our listeners, can you explain the concept of internationalization and what purpose it serves people?
Yes, it's a process of diversifying yourself amongst a number of jurisdictions so that no one jurisdiction really owns you or can dictate to you. It's a known fact that countries have a tendency to treat their guests a lot better than they treat their own citizens. Once they feel that they own you, they can be a lot rougher on you and make greater demands. So if you are diversified amongst a number of countries, what you would ideally hope to do would be that you'd have your citizenship in one country, probably have your residency in a second country or even more than one country, that you'd have your income in a third country possibly, and even have your banking or wealth storage in a fourth country.
So is the goal here not to become a citizen of multiple countries? Or, I mean,
yes, that's right.
How difficult is it for someone to go about doing this? Does it take a number of years, a lot of extensive planning? Maybe you can give us some insights there.
Well, it certainly does take some planning. What it really takes is that you research some places where you'd be happy being, or you feel that you'd be better treated, and the laws that are in those countries would treat you better. For example, if you happen to be a U.S. citizen, which is one of the most difficult countries to be a citizen of right now, because they tax their citizens worldwide, and other countries don't do that, what you'd want to do is find a country that you could either be a citizen of or at least be a resident of or have investments in that have no direct taxation, either little or no direct taxation. Then you would have more of an opportunity to keep the money that you've made rather than simply turn it over to others.
Fair enough. So you yourself, Jeff, have lived in the Cayman Islands for some time since the 1980s. I know that you obviously, as per our previous discussion, have residences in multiple places, but you've chose Cayman for a number of years now as kind of your home base. You've witnessed that jurisdiction undergo a huge amount of growth. You've personally played a significant role in the country's development. What can you tell us about the Cayman Islands, and why is it such a unique jurisdiction? And I think that ties in again to the overall question of how someone may pick the ideal jurisdiction for their geodiversification.
Well, that's a tough one. I don't know how much time you've got, but there's quite a long list. I think if I were to try to simplify it as best as I could, I'd say that first of all, Cayman got a very late start. This was a backwater until 1968. So we've only really been in business per se for 50 years. And that's a good thing, because the longer a country is in business, the more laws it has on the books and the more conflicting they are. And laws don't tend to go off the books. They remain forever. And they create quite a mess. In the Cayman Islands, the laws are very simple. When they were first drawn up, they were drawn up to be simple so that politicians couldn't mess with them very easily. Very much like the American Constitution. That was its purpose, to try to be as simple as possible so that it couldn't be messed with and hard to misinterpret. But there's an additional advantage here that it means that for an investor, it's easy to operate in the Cayman Islands. You don't have so many stumbling blocks of laws that are confusing and self-contradictory. So the simpler things are, the easier it is for you to function within that jurisdiction. That's quite important, especially when you consider that for someone coming from another country, they don't want to go through the process of learning all those laws. They just want to know that they're going to have an easy road, that once they understand what they need to do, that they're going to be okay. Also, it's a small jurisdiction, and that means that we're on a first-name basis with our political leaders, so they can't get out of hand very easily and drop enormous bombs on us where they're going to change how we live and what our laws are going to be. If they start to take a bad turn, we can actually sit them down and say, you're making a mistake here. You're going to need to back out of this. And we actually can work one-on-one with them. It's a tremendous advantage. Our leaders understand that the great majority of our prosperity is generated by overseas investors who have the freedom to withdraw at any time. So to cut back on economic and social freedoms would mean the end of their political careers, unlike most countries and unlike large countries. So they know that they can lose everything they got very easily if they start to misbehave and suddenly get grabby or decide that they're going to impose taxation or whatever else. So they have a vested interest in sticking to the promises that we've made to investors. If they keep changing things regularly, they know that money is going to leave here. So they have to behave themselves. Of course, we're mainly known as being one of the most tax-free jurisdictions in the world. In our 500-year history, we've never had any direct taxation of any kind. So it would be very, very difficult for them to ever even try to pass a law regarding taxation, to create taxation, because the island would be in an uproar over it. Everyone would understand that they're cutting everyone's throat. And even though they'd like to tax us directly, they can't really do that or their careers are over.
And what else can you tell us about the Cayman Islands? I mean, obviously, it's a favorable place to be an investor, or if you own a business, or if you're a resident. What about the quality of life? I mean, a lot of people have never had the chance to go to Cayman. I myself was lucky enough to live there for a few years. What about the overall quality of life, the education system, the infrastructure? What should people expect when they set foot on the sunny shores of the Cayman Islands?
Well, it's a slightly different structure from what you would have if you were in Europe or North America, because it's a tiny place which has an enormous amount of money pouring through it. It's the 5th largest banking center in the world, and yet we only have 65,000 people. So we can have a very small government, and yet because the company fees are high and the revenue per capita into the government is high, we can afford to have a very good infrastructure here. Our roads are very, very good. Schools are good. We started off from as a very good jurisdiction in terms of morality. We have a very traditional morality here that's almost Victorian in its nature. Caymanians tend to be very moral people, very honest people. They keep their word. We don't have any problems with racism here. That it just doesn't exist. We're all the same, regardless of what we look like. We just all treat each other as kind of a big family. And we have very little in the way of violence and crime here. And most all of that is pretty controllable. Unlike 50 years ago when we were a backwater, the standard of living has raised considerably, where most people tend to live very well. Anyone who wants to work can work. We don't have a problem with people being out of work unless they just don't feel like doing it, and we have those in every society. But because of the high standard that we now have, it's more expensive to live in than most places. You certainly wouldn't want to be 25 years old with a tent and a backpack and go and live on the beach. It isn't that kind of place.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of backpackers in Cayman. And is it possible, or how easy is it for an American citizen? A lot of the listeners today will be Americans. Jeff, how easy is it for them to establish some sort of presence in the Cayman Islands?
It's actually quite easy. The easiest way is to get employment here. And there you'd only have to have applied for some sort of position and gotten it, and then a work permit would be applied in your name to the government. And as soon as it's approved, then you, from that moment on, even though you hadn't even arrived here yet, you would be legally resident. And you would have an income waiting for you. So that's really the easiest. However, if you were an investor, say someone retiring, and you didn't want to have actual employment, you just wanted to protect the money that you owned and have a good life, you could apply to the government to do that. And there are several opportunities for different types of residency, where as long as you didn't need to work and you could demonstrate that you had enough money to live on, you could get, say, a 25-year residency here.
Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, but sticking with our general theme of why people may want to consider diversifying themselves internationally, what types of financial risks should investors be aware of today, Jeff, that might prompt them to look at these types of scenarios?
Well, much of the former free world, as we once knew it, is on the verge of collapse economically. You have the U.S. after World War II suddenly taking over the world in production, and they were the future. And a lot of countries got on board. Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, all of those countries kind of got on that particular train and did very, very well. But the U.S. went from being the greatest nation in the world in terms of manufacturing to losing almost all of that, and became the foremost creditor nation in the world, debtor nation in the world, rather. And now it's in financially a worse place than possibly any country in the world. It's just that whatever collapse is going to occur, it hasn't happened yet. So that shoe hasn't dropped. But when it does, it won't only be the U.S. that goes down, it'll be all the other countries that are on that particular train. So what that means is that if you want to come out of this well, then you try to diversify yourself into those countries that are not going to be as directly affected. For example, if you wanted to leave the U.S., you wouldn't go to Japan because it's going to be in just as much trouble. But you might choose to go to Thailand, or you might choose to go to Uruguay. There are a number of places that you could choose where you're still going to have quite a good life, and going forward, even possibly a better life than exists in those places now. And historically, this is always true. If you look at history over thousands of years, there's always some country going down and another country coming up. It's just a question of when something is about to collapse, you want to get out. In 1938, you would have wanted to have left Germany if you were a German. It's the same thing now. It's hard to accept that this is about to happen to the great US of A, since it's been the number one for so long, but it's reached its sell-by date.
So you mentioned history. I know that you're a student of history, Jeff, partially because it helps us understand, where we find ourselves today and where we might be heading, because things tend to repeat themselves. So looking into, say, the next 5 to 10 years, you've mentioned obviously that something bad might be coming for the U.S., for other development countries like Canada, Japan, Australia. What is it exactly that you're looking at that might happen that might lead to a collapse?
Well, there's going to be a major debt collapse. It's inescapable at this point. You get to a tipping point where even if it hasn't occurred yet, it's too late to fix it. When you get countries at the point where they're borrowing so much money that they can't even pay the interest any longer, and yet they're moving headlong to borrow more and offering their people increased entitlements, let's say, and we see that in the U.S. where it's rapidly moving in a direction of far greater entitlements, and more Americans are demanding much, much more in the way of entitlements. And somebody's got to pay for this, and the money isn't going to be there. It simply doesn't exist. And in that regard, it's really a question of simple arithmetic. Do the numbers add up or do they not? And historically, the same thing happens in every empire. Every empire ends in the same fashion. because human nature remains the same in any generation, in any era. So the same mistakes end up being made by those in charge. And so you can look at what's happened elsewhere. For example, just in recent history, we can look at 2001 in Argentina and examine that, or you can visit Zimbabwe and research what happened there in 2008 and watch that collapse, how that unfolded. Or we could take a trip right now to Venezuela and watch that in its collapsing stage. I started warning about Venezuela, I think about 8 years ago. And ever since then, in articles that I've done, as this is where they are now. And so they're right in the middle of their collapse and nearing the end of it at this point. So you can kind of watch the movie as it's played out in other nations and say, this is the pattern. You can examine the pattern, and it's almost always the same. So you follow that and you say, well, this is what potentially is going to be happening in the country that I live in. So it's not a question of trying to change the country, because historically it doesn't work. What you do instead is you step aside. You simply let it go past you by being in another jurisdiction.
That makes a lot of sense. Obviously, until that collapse occurs, if there are going to be more entitlements, it sounds like there's going to be more taxes. So even waiting between now and when that collapse might happen, and whether it be in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, in the meantime, it sounds like you're going to be paying more tax. Things are going to get more uncomfortable for you anyways if you happen to be, middle class or someone that has a fairly high net worth. So what are some of the things that people can do today, right now, aside from educating themselves? Obviously, they can read, Doug Casey's International Man. They can inform themselves about some of the jurisdictions. But what are some of the practical things that people should be looking to do to start this process?
Well, let's see. First of all, I tend to focus much more on what's coming than what exists right now. Most people try to face whatever is facing them right now and saying, can I live with this? My approach is to be looking ahead 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And for whatever reason, I've always done that all my life. And so based on what's coming, I say to myself, can I live with that when it happens? And if not, I want to get out of the way of it. For example, the worst hasn't happened in the U.S. by any means. Some people who would be saying, well, if I see it get bad, then I'll get out. But historically, what ends up happening is that you then start having capital controls. Your government places capital controls on you so that you can't move your money out. You can no longer take it out. And they will use a number of reasons why this is necessary, but it's usually not true. This time around, they'll blame it on money laundering or terrorism, so that you're some sort of an evil person if you actually want to take your money out. That will be followed by migration controls, where you are physically not allowed to leave. If you try to leave, you lose your passport. And so a lot of these laws have already been written for the states. Over the last 8 years, there have been a whole pile of them that have been written but not yet implemented. So we know they're coming. We know that they intend to implement these laws, but they're not quite finished with what appears to be a boom time, and it is actually a decline time. So if somebody wanted to deal with this, the first thing that they would do would be to begin by liquidating all their assets in any country that is at risk. They don't want to leave them there, and that would mean everything. Anything that you keep behind is sacrificial, and that would include a bank account. Even if you continue to live in that country, you'd keep only 3 months worth of spending money in a bank account, and then regard that as being sacrificial. It could conceivably be lost, because in the U.S. you have a confiscation law as of 2010, which allows the banks to confiscate all of the money that you have on deposit in a bank. And very few Americans know that. But there it is. It's there in black and white. It's in the American law that banks can do that. So you'd want to liquidate your assets. Then you'd want to expatriate the proceeds. And then, if possible, if you can afford it, you would establish a residency somewhere else and then prepare an exit plan. So that if it got to the point where you say, whoops, this is really beginning to fall apart now. I can't take it any longer. I'm going to make an exit. And at that point, you may not even be able to sell your house. You may have to just turn the key in the door, wave goodbye. But at least if you have an exit plan, if you've done everything in advance, you just pack a carry-on and out you go. Those people will be able to escape. A lot of people will not be able to.
Yeah, it sounds like the underlying message here is to start preparing for this sooner than later, and to have your solutions in place before people start to panic and before there's a rush to the door, which is often the case.
Yes, exactly right. Two things will happen. First of all, you may not be allowed to leave, but also, historically, this is always true, all of those countries that are welcoming people from any given country pull in the welcome mat. And again, Nazi Germany in 1938, there was a huge conference in 1938 when the Jews attempted to begin to leave Germany. They all got together and said, there's going to be millions of them. We can't take them, but we don't want to look like bad guys, so let's all make an agreement that we won't take them. Then they'll have nowhere to go. Then they'll just stay where they are, and that's exactly what happened. That was the Evian conference in Evian, France, in 1938, yes. Put together by the U.S. government. So that will happen again. The welcome mat will be pulled in a lot of countries. So whatever legal residency you want to have somewhere else, you need to get it in place now while the welcome mat is still out.
Well, Jeff, it sounds like we're just starting to scratch the surface of this topic. We're going to have you back on and take a deeper dive. I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure as always listening to you. Such a wealth of knowledge. I encourage people to follow your work with Doug Casey's International Man. You're a weekly contributor to their website, to their newsletters. I'm also going to post your email, if you don't mind, along with this audio recording, because I know that people might have some follow-up questions for you. Again, Jeff, thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay, you're quite welcome. Good to talk to you, Mark.